I wanted to welcome everybody for joining us tonight. We are really excited to have you. And my name is Jill Lawson. I'm the Executive Director of Assessment and Student Services for Lindbergh Schools. And soon you'll be hearing from Dr. Mapp, who is our new Director of Inclusion, Equity, and Diversity, excuse me. But I wanted to, before I turn it over to Dr. Mapp, I just wanted to share a little bit about tonight's webinar. And what it will focus on is our work that is being done through our equity committee that Dr. Mapp is leading, and also talk a little bit about the professional learning that is happening in our schools for this work with our teachers, administrators, and our support staff. So throughout this webinar, if you have any questions, you can put them in the Q&A down at the bottom, and we will do our very best to answer your questions. Dr. Mapp, do you want to add anything?
I think that'll be it. Most everything else we'll see in the presentation here in a second. So
okay, sounds great. I will turn it over to you.
All right, thank you, and thank you to Tony Dobson from the Communications Department for being with us tonight and leading us in our walkthrough, looking at inclusion, equity, and diversity here in Lindbergh Schools. So I'm excited to be here with you all tonight. And we'll get started. So we'll go ahead to the next slide here, and I'll talk a little bit about myself. I am very glad and feel like it's an opportunity and a privilege to be here with you all as the Director of Inclusion, Equity, and Diversity for Lindbergh Schools. I'm really excited about this opportunity, and mostly because of how this position was specifically and intentionally named. This work has been around for a long time, and it is generally referred to as DEI, or Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion work. Here in Lindbergh, it was intentionally titled Inclusion, Equity, and Diversity. And what that means to me, at least, is that as a district, our focus is on inclusion. We are here to recognize that we all come from different backgrounds, we all have different perspectives, and the inclusion of all of those different backgrounds and perspectives is the most important thing that we can do as a district. Equity, that idea of being able to make sure that everyone can access and can achieve as best they can, that is the piece of equity, and that's important that we have equity in our policies. It's important that we have equity in our practices, and so that's where equity comes in, and it comes after inclusion. And then finally is diversity, and diversity is that true and very important honoring of perspective, in my opinion. It is understanding that we are all different and we all come from different places and different backgrounds, and those things make us great, and those things are to be celebrated, and they come in so many different ways, and so we have to recognize that we are diverse, and we have to make sure that we are very appreciative of that fact. So we'll go on to the next slide. I wanted to take a minute. I don't know how many of you have had an opportunity to be at our buildings yet. I know that our buildings are back open to the public, but you may not necessarily have to go up to the building and see it all the time. And so this is something that you will see at every one of our buildings, pretty much at the main entrance of our buildings, is that this important statement to remind us about what our buildings are. They are places for learning, and they are places and spaces that it's really important to make sure that we welcome and we honor every one of our students. And so I'm gonna just take a look at this and read it. You can look at it with me. It says to please take responsibility for the energy you bring into this space. Your words matter, your behaviors matter, our students, our students, staff, and families matter. At Lindbergh Schools, we celebrate human dignity and act with integrity. We show empathy and respect for others' thoughts, feelings, and perspectives, and we develop and maintain positive relationships. And those come directly from our Lindbergh Life Success Skills. And that is what we want to make sure happens every day with every student as they come into our spaces. And so this is something you'll see on our buildings, and I ask that you honor that in this space as well, that we look at this opportunity to treat each other with human dignity, to act with integrity, to show empathy and respect, and to develop and maintain some positive relationships as we go through thinking about and looking at this work in our district. We'll go ahead to the next slide. So I want to talk about Lindbergh's equity mission. And the next slide will show it to you here. Lindbergh Schools is committed to creating and maintaining an equitable and an inclusive community of belonging, where all stakeholders are treated with dignity. We strive to uphold high academic standards for all students through inclusive classroom instruction, professional learning, and sustainable relationships with our community. Our efforts around inclusion, equity, and diversity are led by our Teaching and Learning Department in cooperation with our Inclusion, Equity, and Diversity Committee. And this statement is something that I mostly inherited, but I also thought about our work this year and our work over the next few years, and I'm really excited, and I'll talk a little bit about this soon. We are fortunate to be working with the Core Collaborative to be supporting our work with inclusion and our work with belonging. And so those are a couple of words that you see echoed all throughout this statement. Again, inclusion is the first and the most important thing that we do as a district, is that we include the diverse perspectives, we include the diverse experiences of all of our students, and also that we are creating this culture in the space of belonging. And that space and culture is important for every person, for students, for staff, for parents, for everyone who is a part of our community, our learning community, alongside our students. We'll go on to the next slide. So the next piece that I get the opportunity to lead is our Inclusion, Equity, and our Diversity Committee. And so this committee meets, we've met once so far, and we will meet 2 more times throughout the year. But in addition to those meetings as a whole group, we have some subgroups that meet as well. And so on the next slide, you'll be able to see those. We have a committee that looks at academic access and curriculum. We have one that looks at policy, one that looks at human resources and professional learning, and one that looks at communication. And so those 4 areas are areas that we feel it's important for us to make sure that we have equitable practices, that we are supporting the inclusion of every student and every perspective in those areas. And so these groups also meet in addition to the whole group meeting and committee meetings. The leaders of these groups will also do some meetings on the side and in addition, so that these committees can do the work that is necessary to make sure that we are continuing to always review, always look at our policies, look at our procedures, look at the things that we do each and every day for our students, and make sure that they're equitable practices, that they're inclusive of each and every perspective. We'll go on to the next slide. So the next piece that we are so fortunate to be able to have with us now is the Core Collaborative. And so the Core Collaborative is a group of a couple of authors who wrote a book called Belonging Through a Culture of Dignity, and they are John Crownapple and Floyd Cobb. And so they, through their work with this book, have been in contact and have been working with our staff, starting with our leadership team, so the superintendent and members of what is known as the cabinet, which is the group of people that support our superintendent, Dr. Lake's work around supporting all students. And so we met with them the first week in October, and we got to see some things around what they plan to do and what they plan to help us do to create this culture and this space of belonging, where we can treat each and every one of our students with dignity as well. And so this is something that we are very excited about. And so I'm going to take you through a few things in terms of what that work looks like. So on the next slide, you'll see what their definitions are of belonging and of dignity. And I will, just for the sake of being able to make sure that everyone can see and hear, I'll just read it to you. Belonging, it is the extent to which people feel personally appreciated, they feel validated, accepted, and treated fairly within an environment. And then there is the important piece of dignity. Dignity is our inherent value and worth as human beings. Everyone is born with it. Dignity is an internal state of peace that comes with the recognition and acceptance of the value and vulnerability of all living things. And so it's important to us as a district to make sure that we create space that people feel like they belong, that people feel like they're appreciated, that they're validated, that they're accepted and treated fairly, no matter what their background is. And so we do that through honoring dignity. We do that through making sure that we are being and supporting this inherent value, this fact that everyone deserves this piece of support from all of us as well. And so this work is really important. And one of the really big things that they talked about and they pointed out when they met with us initially was that this is not something that they come in and they tell us what to do. They work alongside us. This is a collaborative effort. They're called the Core Collaborative because it's something that they do alongside us in supporting our work to support students. And so what we'll be doing is we'll be talking about what does it look like to appreciate, to validate, to accept and treat fairly our students, our staff, our parents, our community. And then through figuring out that belonging, how that happens, we'll figure out what measures we need to do, what we need to do to measure it, to evaluate it, and continue to make sure that everyone is not only getting treated with dignity, but that they feel like they're in a space in which they belong. We'll go on to the next slide here. So I want to talk through something that John Krawnapple and Floyd Cobb talked about with our awareness series. And so the awareness series is a group of teachers, of administrators, of our special school district staff, our counselors that had the opportunity to start and will be in throughout 6 full days in the school year, meeting with Dr. Cobb and Mr. Krawnapple and talking about this idea of belonging through a culture of dignity. And so they talked about the importance of understanding and of having belonging in our schools and in our spaces. And so you'll see here some of the things that we often refer to as Maslow, if you've ever heard of it. And so that's the idea that there are physiological needs that must be met before anyone can do anything else. And so that's what you see there on the far left under the number 1 is physiological and safety. Those are a couple of needs that must be met in order for anyone to function in any environment. And so you see there someone trying to jump from that idea of making sure that I have my Maslow, my physiological and safety needs met, trying to jump over to that piece where you see achievement there. And you see a gap. So we don't know what that gap is right now. What is that that's missing in order for someone to be able to, if they have their needs met, like they have food, they have water, they have shelter, those things are in place. What is it that's this big old gap in between them being able to achieve? And so we'll go ahead here. You'll see that we often as a society look at this and we say, well, yeah, achievements, what's the next important step? After you have those Maslow needs met, we need to then achieve. And so you can see there someone trying to work to get towards that achievement. And that's the number 3 there. And then you see the number 4, which is belonging. And that's the piece that we're talking about, that we're trying to make sure that we honor for each and every one of our students, for our staff, for our parents, for our community in this. How do we make sure that everyone feels like they belong in this space? And so if you click next, you'll see actually a different balance. And so if we actually look at this and switch that number 3 and that number 4, if we look at it and we say, man, it's really important after we meet those Maslow needs, it's really important that we make sure that we create a culture of belonging, that we create a space where people feel like they belong in the environment, they are needed in that environment, they are important to that environment. Then from that belonging piece, they can make a pretty easy step there, you see, towards achievement. As we focus on this, as we look at making sure that we have a culture of dignity, of treating people the way that they should be treated, and of making sure that we create space that people feel like they belong, we will inherently move towards better the academic and achievement success. As we address that, as we look at making sure that the culture and the climate of our schools and of our spaces are intact, we can better achieve. We can reach that final step there you see there of self-actualization at step 5, where we're trying to get everyone to, as they continue to work not only to graduation from high school, but even beyond high school, because this is something that we are always looking at. We're always changing, we're always growing, we're always becoming more educated, and we should be doing that. We should be thinking about things differently. We should be looking at how our perspective is changed based on our experience. And that should always drive what we do each and every day as we grow in this world and do things better for the sake of others. So we'll go on to the next slide. And excuse me, the biggest thing that they focused on in talking about their work, them being Dr. Cobb and Mr. Crownapple, is that they focus on the outcome over the process. And so you'll see here on their slide that it is about creating a climate of belonging. The climate of belonging has to be rooted in the culture of dignity through treating people the way that they deserve to be treated, through honoring people's perspectives, their backgrounds, their experiences. We can create space where everyone can feel like they belong, where people feel like they are treated the way that they should be, that their voice is honored, their humanity is honored, that we are a space that is safe and that is brave for each and every individual that's a part of our space. So we'll go on to the next one. And I want to talk about this final thing, which is the idea of restorative practices. And I'm really excited about this. I have had an opportunity to be a part of restorative practices for all 10 years of my work as an educator. I spent time in the classroom in Maplewood Richmond Heights. I spent time as an assistant principal in the Kirkwood School District. And in both of those spaces, we had a good focus on restorative practices. And so I want to talk a little bit about what that is and how, in ways that we can understand it in the few minutes that we have to talk about it. So on the next slide, you'll see the big three around restorative practices. And restorative practices looks at this idea. It's interesting because it really falls so well in line with that piece that we just talked about of belonging. Restorative practice is about belonging over inclusion. And so, yes, I feel so fortunate that my title again is Inclusion, Equity, and Diversity. As I thought about it and I thought about it more, I'm like, man, I really wish belonging was a part of my title too, because really that's really what I do and what my work is all about, is making sure that we have space that people feel like they belong into as well. And why is it belonging over inclusion? And I will say this, the reason that is because inclusion says that in order for the space to be inclusive, I just have to make sure that everyone can be welcome there, that I don't say that you can't come there. But instead of just saying that you can't come there, belonging says not only is it that you can come here, but this space needs you. This space does not function without you. You are so important and so valued in this space that you belong here. And so that's where that idea of belonging over inclusion comes from, is that it's about more than just being there because you're welcome to be there, but you are needed and you are necessary in that environment. That's where we come from when we talk about belonging over inclusion. Social engagement over control. That is something that's really important, and teachers struggle with this, and I have to help them get there. So much comes from allowing our students to work with us to develop how we work to support their learning. As we look about and we think about, one of the things that a lot of people will talk about over the last 10 years in education is what we call Kagan structures, which is some cooperative learning things that we've done throughout years of education to help students be able to work together to be in charge of their learning. And so that comes from a social engagement. It comes from allowing students to talk. We're no longer in spaces where schools are in, kids are in rows and everybody's looking at the teacher at the front of the class and you listen and you're quiet. That's not what classrooms look like these days. They look like spaces where students work collaboratively, where they support each other in their learning, and honestly, they learn from each other. And so social engagement over control is so huge in that. And finally, the other piece of restorative practice is meaningful accountability. And so that is what we come from specifically in terms of what we call harm circles, which are necessary and are part of restorative practice. But more importantly, we also have community building circles. And so all of those things come from this piece on meaningful accountability. As we work to help students be able to see, what actions that they take, what do they mean, what do they actually, what impact they have. They can help to make sure that they continue on in life, that they make great choices, or if they don't make great choices, what are things that they can do to help fix those choices that they've made, and not just them be things that really aren't helpful for society. How can we make the things that happen things that they learn from and things that they grow from? So we'll go on to the next slide. So as I was talking about, there are two really specific circles that I really focus on in terms of as I introduce restorative practice, and that is what we call community building circles. They focus on thinking about our climate. They focus on thinking about building school community and culture that is positive. And so that can look a lot of different ways. Some of my favorite community building circles have questions like, what's the best thing that you ate in the last 24 hours? Can you name two people that make you laugh out loud? Those are things that we do to help build community, to help connect with one another, that allows us to be able to really get into supporting each other, and being a part of a community where we feel like we're connected. Um, the other part of restorative practice is what we call harm circles, repairing harm circles. And that is when we address student behavior. And so that looks like having conversations when things happen that shouldn't happen, so that they don't happen again. It's not enough to just say you shouldn't do that, don't do that. It's important that we talk about why it's not okay, who that impacted, and how we can do what we can do to make that right. And so when we talk about harm circles, there are three questions that we ask, which are what happened, who did it impact, and then how do we make it right? And so we look at that from a perspective of making sure that everyone is treated with dignity, that we are honoring perspective, both perspectives in those cases, or multiple perspectives when there's student behavior, and addressing it according to that. We'll go on to the next slide. So I want to finish here, and I want to just talk about a little bit about myself. You can see a few pictures of myself, my family there, my wife and my son Harris, and our dog Olive there at the bottom, and also our parents. And so this quote, though, that you see there is a quote that I have on my resume, and it's that I see and I appreciate differences in people, and I find ways to make these unique qualities positive rather than negative. I believe that we live in a world that is diverse. No one person is the same as the next. And so I recognize that. And I recognize that with that comes a responsibility for us to figure out how we can make those things that make us different, positive things, how we can look at them as things that allow us to be better and to be stronger as individuals and as a group of people, so that as a collective, we can do what's best, in this case, for our students. We can do what's best for our community. We can do what's best for each other. So with that, I think we are to an opportunity for you all to ask questions. And so I know there are some in the Q&A, so I have not looked at them. So I'm going to go ahead and pull up some things here and see what we can find out here. So I think we can address a few of these. So how are community members chosen for our committees? And so I'm going to go ahead and talk to that a little bit. My choosing of that was actually mostly looking at who was a part of that committee in the past. And we didn't look at adding new people this year specifically, but if people have reached out and asked to be a part of that work, there hasn't been anyone who has said, you're not allowed. We look at it and we allow people to be a part of that work because we're looking for perspective. We're looking for people to help us in that work. And so that's something that we definitely welcome people to be a part of that. I'm taking a look and seeing what else is over here in the chat or in the Q&A. So I will say that when we look at and think about inclusiveness, we look at inclusiveness as making sure that everyone who's there feels like they're honored and treated with dignity. That looks like, every student, no matter who they are, what they look like, what perspective they bring, what they bring to our table. Everyone's included. If they're a student and they're enrolled with us, then we deserve to treat them with dignity. We deserve to treat them and make sure that they feel like they belong. And so that looks like, making sure that all of our students are seen as individuals and that they are treated with dignity and with respect. So I would say that I can't speak for the core collaborative's definition, but I can say that is how our definition, and as I said, we work collaboratively with them to do that work.
I can talk a little bit about one of the questions that was brought up is Maslow's theory evidence-based. And I will say that the work on Maslow's theory is based off of observations, and it is often, there are times where people argue that the order of his theory behind what is physiological needs, safety, sense of belonging, to getting all the way to self-actualization are often, talked about and discussed. But we can say that it's not always about evidence-based, but also just common sense. When we see our kids and they're hungry, or they haven't eaten, or they need food, or things like that, we know that those are barriers to the learning experience. And so we do want to make sure that our students' needs are being met at the most basic level. And then also thinking about the importance of safety and security, ensuring that when our students are in our buildings, that they know they matter, that they're loved, that we have high expectations for them, for their learning. And those are all things that are really important, but safety and security. There's another theory out there regarding, it's just a theory reading about that actually connection is one of the most important parts, that even before some of those basic needs, that students need to feel connected. And so it's just really about meeting the students where they are, identifying any barriers or things that could keep them from, learning at high levels at our school, and addressing those for our students. And so, and we do know that one of the questions that was brought up is, how do we define community? And it's really just goes into the idea of making sure that our students know that they're important and they're a part of, the classroom, and their voices are being heard. So it's really just about that sense of you matter. We have high expectations for you. You're a part of the learning experience. Here, we want you to grow in your learning throughout the year, and that we're going to do it all together. We're a community. One of the other questions that's brought up is about the evidence behind restorative practices. And I have read some of that information as well. That's definitely something that's being reviewed. When we talk about restorative practices, I think that what we really want to focus on is the inside the classroom, what's happening as far as the kids getting to know each other. And again, using that term, building community, which means understanding that they're a part of the class. And so I think it's really, the restorative practice piece is mostly focused on preventative measures. We don't want to get to a situation where we have to use things such as harm circles, which brings up another question are the parents notified before students participate in any harm circles? And yes, because typically when a harm circle takes place, there's been some type of incident that has happened. And so parents are a part of that discussion. And the work is all about addressing those needs, not only so that students understand that, the harm that has been caused, but also to prevent any future incidents from happening, and making the discipline more about learning and avoiding it from happening in the future, and not just about the consequence alone. Although one of the myths behind restorative practices is that consequences don't happen and that it takes place, and that is not accurate. Consequences are important. When we make decisions, when we make the wrong decisions, we have consequences, but we do want to learn from those, and we want to prevent them from happening again in the future.
Yeah, that's a really big point that I make in talking with teachers, is that I do remind them that it is not, having restorative practices is not void of consequence. They go hand in hand. They're a part of working together to make sure that we address student behavior. And again, think more long term, that's not just, that immediate behavior, but how do we address and make sure it doesn't happen again in the future. I want to talk to a piece here where there's a question about validating people and individuals. And, again, I'll go back to that piece of human dignity, that, I'm not going to tell anyone what to believe. That's not my job at all. It's not about, deciding if something works or doesn't work with their faith, but it is important that everyone who I come across, I treat them with dignity. And it's important that if, whatever they ask, that I'm able to respect that, as an individual, because they deserve to be respected as an individual. And so that's what we ask that our students do, is that they respect each other, they treat each other with dignity. And through that, if that, that means to validate, to recognize them for being who they are. And so again, I wouldn't say that that means that we ask students to go against their faith. I just think it means that we ask students to treat each other with dignity.
There's a question regarding, are parents allowed to opt their students out of harm circles? And I would say in all circumstances, we want to collaborate with our parents. So if this is something that parents have a concern with, or, if it's particularly if it pertains to a certain type of situation, we can't say that harm circles are appropriate in all situations. I think it's important to get the parent feedback and parent input on how those things are addressed. So to answer that question, yes, I think it's always important to have parents involved in the discussions. And if it's something they may have some insight to something that could cause, more harm, some context. And so I think that's important to get that information from parents as well. So one of the questions on here as well is, how is the equity and inclusion movement going to address the literacy issues in the district where a substantial number of our children do not have the skills and services they need to learn to read effectively? And I mean, that is at the heart of it. Like, number one, the most important thing is that all students have access to the grade level essential skills. That is very important work. And not only that, but they're expected to learn at high levels, and we're monitoring growth along the way. So I think that this work does tie into that. I think that it's really going into the looking at, do all of our students have access to that? And if they don't, how are we addressing it as a district? And then if they don't understand something, how are we intervening? So I think that this does play a very important role into that. And that's been a huge topic of conversation between Special School District and Lindbergh Schools. We're continuously trying to improve our efforts to make sure that kids are getting access to what they need regarding literacy, and that we're addressing it with strategies and instruction that works. And although I will never ever sit on here and claim that we have it just perfect, because I think we are going through this process, but that is our ultimate goal. I think to whomever asked that question, we share a common goal on making sure that our students are all getting what they need so that they can move on to the next level and learn those next set of essential skills.
A question related to getting students' perspectives. I think that comes directly from restorative practices. And so what restorative practice is, and those circles we talked about, those community building circles, for example, again, that's like the way we get students' perspective is sitting in a circle and allowing students to be able to answer questions. Like I said, something like, what was the best thing you ate in the last 24 hours? Name 2 people that make you laugh out loud. Those are ways that we get students' perspectives. We ask those questions sitting in a circle and allowing people to connect over their answers and how they connect with one another and their similarities over some of those choices and things that they choose to answer. Other training that teachers are getting involving equity and diversity in the classroom, those things, they answer that. That's something that every teacher and every building leader has. There are teacher conferences all over. There's national conferences, statewide conferences, all those types of things that teachers do, that they are always welcome to ask administrators about being a part of, and they can do training through that. Specifically at the district level, we are supporting and teaching, giving teachers opportunities to learn through our work with restorative practices, and then also through the core collaborative. But those are some other ways that teachers get their training and their development as well. I'm going to address this question of activities we could implement in schools to encourage inclusion and belonging. And that's something that we will certainly be working with Mr. Crownapple and Dr. Cobb to develop is, what does that look like as we work to create space that is inclusive and that creates space that's belonging. We'll be talking about that, as we identify what does it look like to treat people fairly, those 4 things, areas that we had listed there. Specifically in Lindbergh, what that looks like for us, we'll be talking about what activities we can do. In addition to that, I will say this week is definitely a huge example of inclusion and belonging in our schools. It is Unity Week, and so you see Dr. Lawson and myself both in orange today with Unity Day at Central Office. But each day throughout the week, it's the different days for different buildings, but everyone's celebrating unity. We're celebrating inclusion, we're celebrating acceptance, we're celebrating being able to belong and to be treated fairly, and all of those things in our schools this week as part of the National Anti-Bullying Prevention Week this week. And so, we're always doing things to make sure that students feel like they belong. We're listening to students and getting their perspective on what things are happening when they don't feel like they belong. And we're addressing those things so we can make sure that we can do our best to make sure that that happens for each and every student.
So I'm sorry, it's taken us a little while to read through some of the questions. Some of them are very long, so I apologize for the long pauses. But one of the questions was asked is, so are you going to require students to use pronouns? And I don't think that our goal is to require anybody to do anything, or just just to answer that particular question is, I think we're just really focusing on getting our kids access to the grade level expectations, making sure they're learning at high levels, addressing when they are not, making sure that they have a sense of belonging and that their social and emotional needs are met. But I want to be very clear that our goal is really just to create an experience where kids are happy is one of our, and learning and growing. And so I really want to assure everybody that that's really what our focus is making sure that everybody has the access to the learning that they need and their social emotional needs, and not trying to push any particular things like to do this or to say this. We want to develop critical thinkers who are able to read and decipher through information and to make sense of it, and not to tell students what to think or how to think or anything like that. Jeremy, did you want to add anything to that? I just wanted to address that particular question.
I think that that's absolutely it. And, again, I go back to making sure that we are treating people with dignity. And I mean, if it doesn't mean, if not saying the pronoun is important to you personally, but you can dignify the other person, then however that works, I'm good with. So, I mean, a lot of times people will just say that person's name, and that's treating them with dignity. I think that's perfectly fine.
Mm-hmm. One of the other questions that was brought up about being careful creating activities and assignments for inclusiveness, making sure that it's not stepping on people's religious beliefs and family values relating to gender for equity. And I think that is a really important thing to bring up. And I'm actually so glad that that was asked, because I think that that's part of our learning process through this work is, working so hard to be inclusive to make sure we're not being exclusive. And I think that we are constantly having those discussions and meeting with parents who have been really amazing, coming to the table, being very brave with their stories and how this work impacts them. So I think it's still a lot about learning and listening to our families and to our students and to our teachers. And so I really appreciate that. We don't want to try to be so inclusive and do work that we are actually excluding others and not valuing other beliefs. So I'm really glad that was asked. And those are things that are always brought up, and we want to be really careful. And I think that goes to how our equity and how our committee members selected. And that's something we are continuously working on, is making sure that our groups have multiple perspectives. I know that we inherited, and gladly so, because we really like our equity committee members, but we inherited them from years, and they've been a part of our group for probably about 3 years. But we always want to examine how we can include multiple voices and multiple perspectives and stuff. And I know student life, we definitely have multiple perspectives, and I get to lead that one. So that's why I'm talking about student life, but I think it's only made the conversations greater. So I'm glad that was brought up too. We should always be examining whose voice is included in the conversation. It's very critical.
I want to address real quick, there was a question about how teachers are trained to handle students that monopolize conversation and discussion. And I would say this is something that restorative praxis is so great in that, because we allow students to sit and they're in a circle, and there's a talking piece, and that talking piece is what controls who talks, and it goes around the circle. And so students have an opportunity to pass if they don't want to talk. Yet, if they would like to say something at any point as the talking piece comes around the circle, they get the opportunity to talk. And so it isn't ever one-sided, because there is not just like one person that gets to talk the whole time. It's everyone gets that opportunity. So specific to, there was a question around that piece on looking at the process versus the outcome. And so what I would say there is as we're developing the process, the reminder is we have to focus on the outcome. It's kind of like one of the things that we use in education, an old theory is UBD, or understand by design. And that is where we look at our learning targets, and from there we figure out what our goals are, about how we do our scope and sequence, how we plan for the year, and then how we actually the last thing we do is actually the lesson plan. So that's what we mean when we talk about looking at the outcome over the process. That we start with the end in mind, that we figure out where our goal is, where we're trying to get, and then from there we develop the process of how we get there. And so that's what that means when we say looking at the outcome over the process.
So one of the other question statements says, I love the focus on belonging. As an SSD parent, I would love to see Lindbergh better collaborate with SSD to increase general education time for students with intellectual disabilities, and any ideas. And so I would think that we are working every day to increase our collaboration with Special School District. We know that they have a lot of expertise to offer in particular areas that we like to tap into. We have been really excited to see where Special School District has been going over the past 2 years with their new superintendent and some of the restructuring in their staffing and resources for our school. And so, yeah, we know that one of the things that I mentioned earlier was about students having access to grade level curriculum. And that doesn't necessarily mean that it's aligned in the same way, that it's, it can be, done through accommodations and modifications. And so all of those things. And we do know that students should all have access to it at whatever level they can, and try to reach those goals. So that is something we talk about all the time with Special School District. But if you ever want to dig in and talk more specifically about some of the inclusion practices that are happening with Special School District, I would love to sit down and talk with you. But I'd really like to introduce you to our new Director of Special Education, Dr. Doyle. She is extremely collaborative. She's all about problem solving, and she wants to hear ideas and from parents as well. So I think she would be a great resource to reach out to. And so I would encourage you to do that. But you can contact me to get to her, or you can just call the central office directly, because that's one of the most amazing things that Special School District has done to be more inclusive, is they've actually placed a director in our district. So we have one person who is supporting all of Lindbergh students, and not one person who is overseeing 3 different districts, which is an impossible job. And prior to that, we had one person who was overseeing 6 districts. So definitely structures that weren't working. And now I think that we are continuously collaborating to make sure that we're putting in structures that do. So I would suggest that you reach out. And then also we can talk and share. We can bring these things up at our LPAC meetings as specific topics. So, because that's where we want to not only spend some time together and, learn with our families, but we really want those to be led by our parents. So would be very interested in continuing that conversation.
There's a question about if additional funds would be, there will be additional funds to address academic equity in the district. And I think that's always something that we are always looking at, where are we putting our efforts, and if it's not in the right places, that we evaluate that. And so we're always looking at how we can better our academic support of students, how we can make sure that we meet the social emotional needs of students. And so we're always evaluating where those, where funds go and how they're used to support our students, because that's, again, where our priority is. There's a question, and I think a common thread that we all know is that idea of how does this DEI program differ from CRT? And I again will say I don't have any I don't know any knowledge of CRT being taught in schools. I do know that our work around diversity, equity, and inclusion, again specifically inclusion, equity, and diversity, is about treating people with dignity, and it's about making sure that we include people, that we value perspective, and that we allow people to be honored in the space that they're in. And so I can't speak to the CRT piece, but what I can say is that we are making sure that we are supporting our students, supporting individuals, and making sure that they are treated with dignity.
One of the questions that was just asked is, for Unity Week, for kindness, acceptance, and inclusion, how are you including students who do not have orange in their wardrobe? And for some people, tomorrow is their day of wearing orange. And so whether students have it in their wardrobe or not all students want to wear orange, and we understand that. But what we do have is we've created stickers for students, and some students, whether they have it or not, they'll just opt to wear a sticker. And of course, some will have an orange ribbon in their hair or a bracelet of some kind. So the schools have considered that with their day and how their day will go, so that all students can feel included. Some will just choose to, I'd rather wear a sticker than an orange shirt, and we totally understand, and that's all good.
I want to address, there's a comment that talks about students not feeling like that they're not able to express themselves in our schools right now. And my hope is that that this is something that we do as a district to make sure that every student gets what we just talked about, that they're treated with dignity, and that everyone feels like they belong. And so, excuse me, I would hope that if we have situations where students are not being treated with dignity and they don't feel like they belong, that they address it with an adult, so that we adults can address that. As I said, it shouldn't necessarily impede upon anybody else's, faith or political background. What it should result in is that people, every student, every adult, every person is treated with dignity in our schools and in our spaces. And so my hope is that that's happening. And when that's not happening, we ask that students and adults bring it to our attention, because that has to happen. Everyone deserves dignity. As we said, it is inherent. It is not something that people have a choice to give or not give. Everyone deserves to be treated with dignity.
So another question is asked about who's leading these circles. And so, for example, in like a high school PAC class during their high school, our teachers leading these and talking about emotional health, sometimes very serious, large topics. And that's a really good question. I don't think that if we are talking about things that are in regard to very serious and I guess would lean on the side of like therapy or therapeutic questions to support kids. I don't think that would be best addressed by, in a PAC class and on the open. So when we think about circles, one of the things to think about is it's not always about heavy topics. Circles can be about content. So I think a lot of times, maybe in a class that you may have been in through your experience or whatever, where students all take turns talking about what the content means to them. So it doesn't necessarily always have to be about a heavy topic. And if it is about something that's heavy, it would be done not in necessarily in a PAC class. Now, students may talk in a PAC class and share their perspective on like their day and how they're doing and all of that, but we wouldn't ask specific personal questions that I think would make them feel uncomfortable. And if we ever did anything like that, it wouldn't be a student-led or a PAC in a PAC class. So as far as who's leading it, if it's in the classroom, it wouldn't be such a heavy topic.
And I want to speak to one of the questions there that's about unity, and specifically how it's important that we recognize that people come together because of common values and rights. And I absolutely agree with that. The whole point of the idea of restorative practices and things that we do around supporting our students and supporting each other and treating people with dignity is around finding those things that connect us. Circles are made and they are intended for people to be seen, for people to be heard, and for people to connect. And so that's what it's about, is certainly figuring out how we can unite, how we can come together, how we can not look, again, as I said, my quote there, I see differences. They exist. They are part of the real world. The question is, do we see them as positive and do we allow them to bring us together, or do we see them as negative and allow them to divide us? And I choose to see them as positive. I choose to allow them to bring us together. That comes through unity. It comes through us treating people with dignity. It comes through us creating spaces of belonging.
I also think it's important to note that Unity Week, it's about an anti-bullying, initiative. It's really about us thinking, about what to do instead of what not to do. And what to do is to be kind, accept, include. And so it gives our kids, we should be doing this all the time as we, we discuss with our students in class meetings and flyer time and PAC time. I mean, it's always appropriate to be kind, but it's just a week for us to think about it as well. And it's good for not just our students, but also for our teachers to just spend that time to think about, being inclusive and being kind and accepting as well. So it's really about, monitoring giving our kids time to reflect on, am I kind? How can I show kindness? I'm going to, make a pledge in some buildings to make sure that I never bully, or to stand up against bullying and to be assertive. And so I think that's really what Unity Week is all about.
And Tony, I think there's just one more click. That's just my email address, as we talked about definitely with the equity committee, but just in general, things around inclusion, equity, and diversity. I'm just an email away. I enjoy talking about the subject. I appreciate that that's what I get to do each and every day. I look forward to hearing your perspectives. I look forward to connecting with you to continue to do what's best for our students and in this work of being inclusive and of working to be with one another. Oh, Jill, you're muted.
And I was trying to turn my mute off and I hit my screen. I'm just a mess here. So I want to thank you guys all so much for joining us tonight. And Dr. Mapp, we're really excited to have you at Lindbergh Schools, and just another welcome. It's been great working with you. And we just want to tell you to please reach out at any time, and we will help you in any possible way to answer any questions. So thank you guys so much and have a great night.